The fog lay low and thick over the sleepy town of Millfield as Sheriff Mark Johnson pulled up to the law offices of Chris Reynolds. The sheriff let out a weary sigh, sipping the last dregs of lukewarm coffee from his thermos before stepping out into the damp morning air. It had been a hellish few weeks, a grisly murder, a scandalous affair, a hotly contested election, all hanging in the balance. The discovery of Rebecca Reynolds' lifeless body on the banks of the Millfield River had sent shockwaves through the close-knit community. That the bright young woman, newly pregnant and only recently returned to her hometown, could meet such a terrible end defied belief. All eyes had immediately turned to her father Chris, the town's most prominent lawyer and aspiring politician. Whispered rumors of the girl's mysterious paternity and Chris' own sordid past spread like wildfire. When it came out that Rebecca had been carrying the child of Chris' own assistant Tim Wallace, the scandal reached a fever pitch. Through it all, only one thing was certain: someone was lying. And it was Mark's job to untangle the web of secrets and lies that had ensnared them all before it was too late. Bracing himself, Mark pushed open the door to the law office, unsurprised to find Chris' secretary Scarlett Jones studiously avoiding his gaze. The usually vivacious redhead had been a shadow of herself lately, jumping at small noises and working long hours. "Morning, Scarlett," Mark called out gently, not wanting to startle her. "Is Chris in yet? I need to speak with him." "In his office," she replied tersely, eyes still fixed on her computer screen. As Mark moved to pass by the reception desk, Scarlett's hand suddenly shot out and grabbed his wrist in a vice-like grip. "You need to look more closely at Tim," she hissed, eyes wide and desperate. "He's hiding something, I know it. Rebecca's death, the pregnancy, all of it. Don't let him fool you." With that ominous warning still ringing in his ears, Mark knocked on the door to Chris' private office. At the muffled assent from within, he entered to find Chris hunched over his desk, head in his hands. The usually confident man looked utterly defeated. "Sheriff," Chris said with a weak attempt at his trademark megawatt smile, "what can I do for you? If this is about the election next week, I've already told you I'm staying in the race. I won't let these ridiculous rumors derail my campaign." "It's not about the election," Mark replied evenly. "It's about your daughter's murder and your assistant's involvement in it." Chris' face drained of color. "Tim? What are you implying? The boy's a friend of the family. Nothing more. He would never hurt Rebecca." "That's not the story I'm hearing," Mark said. "Multiple sources put Tim and Rebecca together in the weeks before her death. They say she told him about the baby. He wasn't happy." "Nonsense," Chris blustered. "Tim's a good man, salt of the earth. These accusations are ludicrous." "Then you won't mind if I question him?" Mark pressed. "See if his story matches yours? Because right now, Chris, I've got means, motive, and opportunity pointing squarely at Tim Wallace. Unless you know something you're not telling me?" Chris stood abruptly, hands clenched at his sides. For a moment, Mark tensed, readying himself for a confrontation. But Chris simply shook his head. "You'll get nothing more from me or anyone else in this office," he ground out. "Now, if you'll excuse me, I have an election to win. Good day, Sheriff." Frustrated but unsurprised, Mark saw himself out. The impasse with Chris was expected. The man's pride and political ambitions would always come first. Mark would have to find the truth another way. As he climbed into his cruiser, Mark pondered his next move. Question Tim directly and risk spooking him? See if forensics had turned up any new leads? Every path felt like a dead end. Suddenly, a flash of red hair caught his eye. There was Scarlett, hurrying down the sidewalk away from the office with a determined stride. Acting on instinct, Mark put the car in gear and tailed her at a discreet distance. She made a series of erratic turns, cutting down side streets and doubling back on herself as if checking for pursuers. But Mark was too seasoned to lose her so easily. Finally, she ducked into a seedy dive bar on the outskirts of town. His curiosity piqued, Mark followed. Inside the dimly lit bar, Mark quickly spotted Scarlett huddled at a back table across from none other than Tim Wallace himself. Sliding into a booth nearby, he strained to catch snippets of their tense conversation. "Can't keep covering for you," Scarlett was saying, her voice low and angry. "Sheriff's asking questions. Won't be long before. I've got it under control," Tim snapped back. "By the time they figure it out, I'll be long gone. Got a ticket booked for Canada tomorrow night." "And what about me?" Scarlett demanded. "You expect me to stay quiet while you jet off scot-free? After everything we did?" Mark's blood ran cold. "We?" So Scarlett was involved too? This went deeper than he ever imagined. He leaned forward, desperate to hear more. Tim said something Mark couldn't quite catch, but Scarlett's response rang out clear as a bell. "Don't you dare threaten me. I'm the one who got rid of the girl, remember? You'd already be rotting in a cell if it wasn't for me." Mark couldn't believe his ears. Scarlett had killed Rebecca? His mind reeled, trying to make the pieces fit. What could have driven the secretary to murder her boss daughter? Just then, Scarlett caught sight of Mark and her eyes went wide with shock and fear. "He's here," she gasped. "He followed me." In a flash, Tim leapt to his feet, chair clattering to the floor. He turned to run, but Mark was faster. The sheriff lunged forward, catching Tim in a flying tackle that sent them both crashing into a table. Scarlett screamed as they grappled on the sticky barroom floor. Tim fought like a wild animal, all blind panic and desperation. But Mark had size, training, and righteous fury on his side. "It's over, Tim," he grunted, finally pinning the smaller man down. "You're under arrest for the murder of Rebecca Reynolds. You have the right to remain silent." As Mark read Tim his Miranda rights and hauled him away in cuffs, Scarlett collapsed into sobs, her careful facade crumbling away. Mark knew he'd have to bring her in for questioning too. Unraveling her role in this sordid affair was the only way to get true justice for Rebecca. But that would have to wait. First, he needed to tell Chris that his assistant, the man he considered a friend, had conspired with his secretary to kill his only daughter and unborn grandchild. It was an impossible conversation, but one that could wait no longer. The whole sordid tale came out in fits and starts over the long hours of interrogation that followed. Confronted with the damning evidence, Tim and Scarlett eventually cracked, turning on each other in a futile attempt to shift blame. It was as tawdry as it was tragic. Scarlett, quietly seething over Chris' continued devotion to his wife Anna, had seduced his new assistant Tim, drawing the naive young man into a web of passion and deceit. They'd carried on their affair right under Chris' nose for months. But their house of cards had come tumbling down with Rebecca's return to Millfield and the revelation of her pregnancy Tim's worst nightmare made real. He knew Chris would never abide the scandal, would cast him out of the inner circle and crush his nascent political dreams. In desperation, Tim had turned to his secret lover for help. Scarlett, already nursing a jealous hatred for the beautiful prodigal daughter, had come up with a plan as cold-blooded as it was brutally simple. Get rid of Rebecca and let suspicion fall on her philandering father. Tim, backed into a corner, had agreed. That fateful night, as Rebecca walked home along the river, Scarlett had appeared out of the darkness behind her. The secretary had once been Rebecca's closest confidant. The girl never saw the betrayal coming. One hard shove was all it took to send her tumbling into the black waters. As Rebecca thrashed and struggled, her screams muffled by the current, Scarlett stood on the bank and watched, and felt nothing but grim satisfaction. Leaving the body where it would be sure to be found, Scarlett went to Tim, hands still shaking, and told him it was done. They were safe, she promised. No one would ever connect them to the crime. The story made Mark sick to his stomach, but he took it all down dutifully. When Tim and Scarlett were finished, he locked them in the cells and threw away the key. Informing Chris was even harder than Mark had imagined. The lawyer had wept openly when he heard what his most trusted employees had done. But it was the look of devastation on his wife Anna's face that Mark would never forget. The betrayal cut her to the core. In the end, Chris dropped out of the election, unable to face the public humiliation. He retreated into his work, rarely coming home. Anna bore her grief silently, a good housewife to the end. But the light had gone out in her eyes. Their family would never recover. Justice had been done, but it brought Mark no satisfaction. Rebecca was still dead, an innocent life snuffed out by petty jealousies and selfish ambition. Watching Tim and Scarlett led away in shackles to begin their life sentences, he could only reflect bitterly on the cost of secrets and lies. As he left the courthouse, a movement in the shadows caught Mark's eye. There stood Anna, pale and drawn, a small valise clutched in one white-knuckled hand. She met his questioning gaze for a moment, a ghost of a smile on her lips, then turned to walk quickly away down the street without a backward glance. In that instant of wordless exchange, a horrible realization swept over Mark with sickening certainty. He suddenly saw the hidden shape of the tragedy, the final missing piece he'd failed to place. Anna had known. The whole time, she had known about the affair, about Scarlett's seething resentment, about the danger to Rebecca, and she had done nothing to stop it. She had let her daughter die to save her marriage, her position, her perfect life. She was just as guilty as the killers themselves. But what could he prove? Omission of action wasn't a crime, and Anna had been so very careful. He would never be able to touch her. No court would convict the grieving mother. She would bury her complicity alongside Rebecca, taking the secret to her grave. The terrible knowledge settled on Mark's shoulders like a leaden shroud, a burden he knew he would carry for the rest of his days. Millfield's long nightmare was over, but the rot at its core would remain, a hidden darkness eating away at the town's very soul. He could only pray that someday, somehow, the truth would out, that the dead would find a voice, and justice would be done at last. Until then, all he could do was keep watch and remember, and never, ever let himself be fooled by a pretty lie again.